Welcome back, everyone. For the next few weeks, we're going to be looking at the development of a couple of different types of genre. And a genre, if you'll recall, is just a fancy word for a category of fiction. Now, this week, we're going to be examining two related genres, the romance and the novel. In particular, we're going to be discussing the novel's origins in the 1700s, as this genre arises out of, in part, um, an earlier form called the romance. Now, people have always told stories, but there are certain categories of stories that end up developing over history. And the development of these different categories or genres allow people to either tell different types of stories or to talk about different things within a similar kind of story. So let's think about romances. Romances actually originate as far back as the ancient Greeks, but the 1700s, or what I might alternatively call the 18th century, is a watershed period where the romance genre gets revised and then combined with other types of writing to create what becomes the modern novel. So we can see this change taking place in the two readings that we're going to be looking at this week. First, we'll see in Eliza Haywood's Phantomina, a work that is drawing on elements of the romance genre and then also riffing on it or revising it. And then we'll see in Frances Burney's Evelina, a work that's also drawing upon and then revising the novel as it develops out of Eliza Haywood's works. So what I want to do before we get started is actually nail down what these two genres are and how they differentiate from one another. When we think of the word romance today, we typically think of an intimate relationship between two people that are dating or living together or even married. But romance is also a type of literature. It can be written in verse, that means poetry, or in non-verse or prose, but it usually recounts two major things. One are acts of bravery, usually by a hero, so adventures, and two is a courtship between a hero and a heroine. And the courtship plot oftentimes revolves around some kind of conflict that keeps the hero and the heroine from being together. And sometimes that conflict may actually be the adventure part of the story. But this conflict typically is resolved by the end of the story, oftentimes in ways that allow the hero and heroine to come together. Now, we still see that same emphasis on love stories in 18th century novels, but novels changed significantly from the romances of earlier ages, that is, romances from the Middle Ages or from the Renaissance. Now, I'm not going to be showing you any pre-18th century romances. We're not reading them largely because they're incredibly long. But it's important to note that the romance has several features that make it quite distinctive from the novel that develops in the 18th century. First of all, romance stories are typically stories that are taken from history or from mythology, and it actually might even mix together elements of both. So, for example, it wouldn't be unusual to read something out of the Arthurian legend cycle. The stories of King Arthur's court are actually taken from a real historical figure, but they're completely fictionalized. And in particular, there are lots of sub-stories that are themselves, totally taken out of fantasy or even out of kind of mythology. Because of that, these romances oftentimes contain both supernatural and historical elements and might contain them at the same time. So it's possible to read in a romance a situation that seems kind of probable, but that also has like marvelous elements that could never exist in real life. So, for example, Sir Gawain in The Green Knight tells the story of a feast taking place in a castle. That part could be probable, but then the characters encounter this fantastical knight where they're not sure if it's an evil spirit or if it's something out of the realm of magic. Similarly, the settings in romances may or may not be real, or they may be kind of a mixture of something that refers to someplace real, but actually involves things that are not real. So, for instance, it wouldn't be unusual to have a romance that has one line saying that it is set in the English countryside. But either there's no other indication that would allow you to identify the setting as being the English countryside, or that romance might delve into some kind of supernatural realm. So it might begin in the English countryside and suddenly you find yourself in, some kind of hell forest landscape. And the characters in romance are similarly taken from either history or from mythology. So the characters are usually either aristocratic, so kings and queens and the members of their court. They're mythological, or they might even be godly. And those characters actually embody cultural ideals, in particular, ideals that people have about honor and about bravery, and also about gender and about certain behaviors. So typically, what we find in romances is that the hero is an aristocrat. Oftentimes, he's a knight. He is handsome, he's super brave, he's super strong, and he's also very honorable. And the heroine will also be aristocratic. She'll be a lady in waiting, or a lady, or a queen, or a countess. And she herself will be incredibly beautiful and also incredibly chaste. That is, either incredibly virginal or incredibly honorable about other romantic commitments that she has. So the result is that the stories that you read in romances, or when you're reading romances, the stories themselves might feel like you're reading an extended fairy tale. Now, as I mentioned, 18th century novels still tell stories about adventures, and they still tell stories about intimate relationships, so romances, but they tend to get written in more probable and realistic ways, and they tend to focus a little bit more attention on character psychology and motivations. So let's take a look at some of the differences. They're written on the right-hand side. 18th century novels tend to be more interested in events and characters with which their readers, who are largely middle class, can identify. So one thing that we'll notice in 18th century novels is that characters tend to have identifiable names that you might hear every day. So whereas in a romance from the 11th or 12th century, you might have Eleanor of Aquitaine, or you might have a character named Lady Lovely. By the time you get to 18th century novels, in particular mid-18th century novels, the characters are going to have names that the readers name their own children. So names like Charlotte or Caroline or Mariah, names along those lines. Similarly, characters in 18th century novels may be aristocratic, but more often than not, they are just very wealthy, but they also are quite diverse in terms of their classes. So characters can be wealthy, but there may be many other characters who are middle class. There may even be characters who are working class or domestic servants. And alongside that, you find in 18th century novels a strong interest in locating those characters in identifiable settings. That is, settings that their readers really can identify with and recognize. So again, whereas if you're in the 11th or 12th century, you might have, kind of just a generalized setting that is taking place in the English countryside, but that has no real markers of being that. In an 18th century novel, characters are going to be placed into settings that their readers can recognize and may have even been to. So places like London, like resort towns like Bath, or border towns in in Edinburgh, or even recognizable places within those cities. So it wouldn't be unusual for characters to be at a very recognizable theater like Drury Lane, or to be at a famous coffee shop, or to be at a famous pleasure garden. And then finally, one of the bigger differences too is that while characters in 18th century novels experience emotions that we see displayed in characters in romance, emotions like love or jealousy or distress, 18th century novels are very clear to delineate those emotions in complex psychological terms, and also to look at real world implications. So, for example, in an 11th century romance, it might be that a hero and heroine are kept apart because the lady is locked in a tower. But in an 18th century novel, The thing that keeps the heroine and heroine apart might be more mundane, actually. It might be more that the hero desperately loves the heroine, but the heroine isn't of a high enough class for him to marry, or maybe has no money. And so he has to then grapple with whether or not he wants to marry a heroine who his family won't accept. So um, this tends to actually change the function of the works that we're reading. Because what we oftentimes find is that when there's formal or generic differences, there might also be a difference in terms of how the work relates to the culture out of which it's arising. So romances tend to shore up social ideals. So if we're looking at romances in particular, they tend to shore up ideals about honor, ideals about chastity, ideals about behaviors for men and for women, and they tend to align those ideals also with aristocracy. So they're shoring up class ideals as well by representing aristocrats as not just people that sort of are the pinnacle of social and political functionings, but also as sort of the embodiment of social ideals. By the time we get to the 18th century romance, we may still see this alignment, and we may still see works that are trying to shore up some social ideals. But at the same time, 18th century novels oftentimes will question those ideals, and in some cases, they may even reject them outright. All right, so we've gone through what makes a pre-18th century romance different from an 18th century novel. And we've outlined ways in which they actually are quite different from one another. But it's helpful to remember that these two categories are not absolute, because we're talking about the way in which one category morphs into another. And that is never an absolute or an easy process. So it's not as though 1700 hits and all authors suddenly look at each other and say, all right, romance is gone. We cannot write about Lady Lovely or Queen Eleanor anymore. We're going to now have to start writing about more realistic characters. Not at all, actually. So there's two things to keep in mind when we think about the way that genres change over time. What I have here is actually a timeline. And what you can see is one pre-1700 romance. It's a prototypical romance that we didn't read. It's called Madame de Lafayette's Princess de Clèves. It was published in 1678. What you'll notice is that from 1700 to 1800, this is really the period that we're dealing with. We're going to be looking at two works. Eliza Haywood's Phantomina is published in 1724. So it's almost halfway between Madame de Lafayette's Princess de Clèves and Frances Burney's Evelina, which is published in 1778. So what you might notice is that Eliza Haywood's work may actually at times appear much more like a romance than it does like a novel. Or alternatively, it might appear to reject romance elements much more explicitly than what you might find in Burney. So when we're thinking about change over time, what we have to remember is that change takes place incredibly slowly, and also that changes take place in fits and starts. So when we think about historical change, especially in literature, we're not thinking about a kind of straight line of evolution. Oftentimes, it's just much more of a kind of jagged series of plateaus moving up and down, but generally trending upward. All right. So as you read these two works, I want you to keep in mind moments where the authors seem to be deliberately trying to create psychological depth versus moments where they're flattening out their characters. We're going to continue to discuss this in the next video and then also on the discussion board. Thank you very much.